You're listening to Selling AI, the show where technology meets the bottom line. We explore how to turn artificial intelligence into real business growth. Here's your host.
Hey there, and welcome to an episode of Selling AI. Today I've got Jean-Marc Chanoine on the show. He's the Chief Sales Officer and GM of the Americas at Templafy, which is a document generation platform. He's been trying to kill off manual document work really since 2014, long before anything got called AI. Jean-Marc started out with a really cool background. He was Navy JAG defense attorney. He ran procurement transformations at Accenture, and he joined Templafy really as a strategic AE in 2019 and worked himself up to Chief Sales Officer. So I'm super pumped to dive into that career arc. Here's what makes it interesting. His argument is that selling AI into the enterprise is really no longer a technical problem. It's a political one. How do you become this safe bet that wins? So today he has a phrase he calls cover your assets, the economy, and really talks about how buyers stall out because they think they can build it themselves and take less risk. So let's dive in. Jean-Marc, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Heard a lot about you. I'm really excited to be here today and excited to have this conversation.
That's great. Really looking forward to dive in. So always like to start with your background, and you have a great career arc. Tell us, how'd you go from Navy JAG through procurement at Accenture into a sales role at like a high growth startup?
Wow, let's call it serendipity. I always want to be a lawyer since I was 12 years old. And, they say don't let 12-year-olds make career decisions for you. So I ended up in the nuclear Navy, had a wonderful time there. And I kind of looked in the mirror and said, you know what, do you want to keep practicing? And I made the decision, ended up at Berkeley, got my MBA. And as you know about Berkeley, it's tech. It's tech consulting, tech finance, tech everything. So I still didn't know what I wanted to do, so I ended up at Accenture Strategy. I was working this project, and I was doing procurement strategy, but the technology around it. And we ended up doing this large-scale project. We were trying to do document automation with one of the hyperscalers. I'll leave them unnamed for the purposes of this conversation. And it didn't work out at all. Like, we spent probably $4 or $5 million, long-term implementation, all types of issues, and it didn't work. So I literally was sent off to go find software to essentially compile contracts. So typed it on Google, saw Templafy, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Clicked the link. We ended up doing a project with them. And so what ends up happening is I emailed the CEO if I could come work there. He asked me, hey, can you sell? I hadn't sold a single thing before then, but I said, yeah. Came in, started our strategic accounts function with a deep focus on the Big Four and Accenture, so think Deloitte, KPMG, PwC, and that took off. And, that really led to this long journey of, I think, 7.5 years now at Templafy, where what we do is we help 4 million users eliminate manual document work. In essence, what we do is prompt to presentation for content that has to be correct. So when you think about audit reports, when you think about contracts, when you think about go-to-market content, it's things that quality matters, tends to be external facing, and there tends to be repercussions when it isn't necessarily correct. So we're in essence prompt to presentation for professionals, and we help the enterprise save time, make more money, lower costs, all that jazz.
I love that. I love that background. There's some similarities there. So I wanted to be an attorney when I was a kid. I had an uncle who was a state judge who, when I was 11, told me there was more lawyers in law school than there were lawyers walking on the earth. So that dream. Don't know if it was true. So I'm sure it was at the time, but got rid of that really quick. And I've also tried to tackle this document workflows, not nearly as successfully as Templafy, but saw a similar problem actually right around email. So I built some machine learning tech to help drive documents out of email, specifically in shipping. So really cool. I'm going to come back to your career arc there later on because I want to talk about emailing the CEO, getting a job, because that's always what you should do, and I haven't done it well in the past. So we'll dive into that later. But let's talk a little bit more about Templafy. It started in 2014. I like the story. A lot of companies seem like overnight hits, especially more so with this AI pivot, right? It seems like you're an AI company you started 2 years ago, you couldn't have started 4 years ago, and you just took off. But most companies are actually in the weeds for years on end, and then like LLMs became a launching point for something new and spurred growth on. In your scenario, like what's been drastically different since LLMs came into play, and what's kind of been the same since then?
I think it's very similar, and that's a great point you call out. That there are very few overnight successes. There are some, but what it takes now to market is deep expertise in an area. And if you go back to 2014, Templafy has always been, let's call us the content slash document experts. Like we understood how content was made, especially when it got complex, especially once you started touching systems of record, especially when you're trying to create a proposal from data from, let's say, Salesforce plus a desktop plus a SQL database, and how that marries together in order to get something, I would say, beautiful, right? Because I think oftentimes people, when they think about documents, they think, oh, okay, it's a document. But if you really think about it, when you're in a sales cycle, right, this might seem a little bit, off, but the quality of the content that you put out really matters. And so during that time, what we were doing was assembling content based on rules-based automation. It means that you had an individual within the organization make a decision that these are the mandatory components of a document, and then you'd inject data into a specific place, right? And that resulted in essentially 100% accuracy because there was a determination by a human that this is the right process. So it did require a little bit of there being, let's say, a repeatable process, right? Because let's say your sales team, you're doing thousands of, or if not hundreds of thousands of proposals. There's similarities between each of those proposals. The product sets tend to be similar, and we compiled them. Once LLMs got introduced, I think what really happened is this idea of magical assembly showed up. It's like, hey, I'm going to give brief instructions to this magic button, and it's going to give me something that works. And I think that for us, LLMs are a tool, right? What they do is they reduce the amount of implementation you have to do. They give more, essentially, variety. It allows us to deploy significantly faster. It's assisting us in the journey that we're taking. So I would say that since LLMs popped up, it's really helped our business because it's allowing for faster creation of content. And so for us, it's just an accelerant. But I think what has really changed is the minds of people that are purchasing it. Is this expectation of a magic button where there isn't any implementation burden. They don't necessarily have to put people or FTEs to determine what the quality of the content should be. So I think it's more of it's like you called out early on, more of a political issue now with LLMs. That's what's really changed, not necessarily from a technology perspective.
Interesting. And we'll get into the buying cycle there. That'll be super fascinating. But let's talk about like almost go-to-market team construction and
Yeah.
this kind of shift that you talk about, right? I think I have a hypothesis that like 2015 to like 2022 was almost like the age of the generalist, right?
Yeah.
Everyone was looking for people with sales skills that were industry agnostic, right? And what's ironic is that LLMs kind of democratize building product and a couple of other processes as well. So like then there's like a whole bunch of new entrants into the market that can do things that they couldn't do before, right? So now there's more people, but now it's almost focused. We've come back to industry expertise is like paramount in this space, especially in driving go to market. Like I don't know, I was heavy on sales skill first. You could teach someone the industry. I've swung like 180 degrees here. Have you felt the same? Have you started to think about the go to market process and kind of the same shift that industry knowledge, process knowledge is just key in this space?
I think it's become more important because pretty much any company can come out with a bad version of a solution. Like they can come out with something, right? And I think the barrier to entry before was significantly higher. When it comes to specific skills, I think it's always been additive. Like in my case, right? What I've seen is that I was a consultant, I was a lawyer, and I studied finance and business school, and our buyers at Templafy were those people. So one of the reasons I was able to climb up quickly was because I had that specific industry knowledge, especially within the organizations I've been selling to. I don't think that has changed. I think being an expert in the arena has always been important because people want to buy from people that they feel are experts. They're learning something, they're picking up something. And I think the big shift now, because of the ability to vibe code, and I won't say enterprises are vibe coding. What they're doing is they're putting engineering teams to use the frontier models to build something with those tools. Let's give them a little bit more credit. that in light of that, part of their engagement with you has to do with your expertise. Because if you're not an expert, they feel that they may be better off just doing it themselves. So I do agree with you, actually. I do think it's become more important. I don't think it's the end all be all that you have some expertise that they don't have internally.
That's a good point. In a scenario, a CFO
Yeah,
told me recently the way they look at LLMs is that the cost of engineering inputs has dropped, and this is a common
right,
theme over the economics for 400 years, right? That's all we've done is drop the cost of inputs, right? But like, it doesn't mean that the company you're selling to, one of the big fours or a large enterprise, has expertise in actually how their teams are constructing presentations and documents in a way that makes any more sense. So they could build that like high level tool that like anyone can build internally, but their expertise is somewhere else, right? So like having the sales and CS person that you're dealing with on a day to day basis not be blind to how that process works and having like some level of like good knowledge, I think has become more important than it was a couple years back. You have to show that you are the option beyond build.
absolutely. I think you're completely right there. I think one thing that organizations are overestimating is their internal knowledge of their processes. And I think it's what I've seen in the market is that like we deal with hundreds of consulting firms and accounting firms, and we've seen a variety of different processes. Oftentimes, when we're talking to a company, they may only know themselves. And the other component of it, they haven't even captured the processes. Because a lot of processes are informal, they're completely informal. So we've gone into organizations with 400,000 users, right? And we're trying to, let's say, automate audit reports, that are required by the SEC and other governing bodies. And then when you actually get in and start having the conversation, they themselves don't necessarily know the exact process of how work exactly gets done. And so by default, what happens is, they give access to the chatbot, they run RAG, they, in essence, great, they can do the research on that component. But when it comes to the actual compilation of the content, we do come in with a specialized knowledge in that case. And if you don't, you're doomed because the problem is it's kind of the blind leading the blind oftentimes in those scenarios. Like they're unsure of what the process is. So if you're completely reliant on the organization you're working with, and this goes for banks, this goes for consulting, this goes for audit, this goes for a lot of professional services firms, and even companies that are, let's say, in consumer goods, same thing. It's these processes weren't designed with LLMs in mind, nor were they captured because the actual knowledge was within the user base and you're getting top down decisions. So I think it's absolutely right that once you become a trusted advisor, it becomes significantly easier to sell software. So you've convinced me that, yeah, you're right. It's been a big shift.
It's not new, right? Like every time I
Yeah,
have this conversation, almost like every single time, it's like what's old is new again, right? So like the human to human
correct.
relationship, what you know versus what is commoditized, has really been elevated in a way that maybe it was de-emphasized 5 years ago. And I think that takes me into our next question. You have like a big hypothesis around the political aspect of buying, let's say, a big piece of software or a service, right? Or like making a safe bet rather than maybe the best potential outcome bet. Tell me a little bit more about this. Where do you see this shift in how execs are buying software and some of the core reasons why they may make one decision over another?
I think the observation I've had, well, I know, I've been through this a lot the past 2 years, is in 2024, if you go back then, everybody was like, "What are you doing with AI?" Right? There were at least at that time two possible bets, and this is before Anthropic truly fully took off, before Claude became like a household name. You're either buying OpenAI through Microsoft or you were buying directly from OpenAI. That was it. And then
Right.
with Anthropic really kind of bumping up quickly, what you saw were massive investments early on, and also CFOs and CEOs not quite understanding what they were buying. And to be fair, how could they? Right? Like, really, it became in the public conscience at the earliest, let's say, end of 22. That was probably the earliest time that people this started deeply brewing, at least within the enterprise. And so big investments were made, but then years started to pass, right? So balance sheets people started looking at it. And the facts simply are that the style and type of ROI that was promised and the performance that was promised isn't there. Now, on top of it, they hired big teams, right? Or at least repositioned folks to be the AI committee or the AI engineering team. Again, folks with very little experience, if you think about it, right? Imagine only having 2 years of experience, or like, okay, great, we're going to throw 100 million or 50 million or 20 million or $10 million at problems that haven't been identified. So now what's happened, okay, big budgets are being spent. I think the layoffs you've seen recently in tech have nothing to do with AI. It mostly has to do with overhiring in 2021, and also the AI budgets are up, and it's like an easy scapegoat for it is like, oh, our AI spend, we're replacing this with AI. That's not it. So now, let's say you're trying to sell a solution to them, right? Let's take Templafy document automation that's fit for purpose, right? It's a solution that is extremely fine tuned to create great proposals, great content that's visually appealing. Great. When you go to speak to these executives, what you end up with is that they've been burnt, right? They've been burnt in the past because some of the early bets with, let's say, startups and other companies, it didn't work out well. So, once you've been burnt once in those scenarios, you start increasing the bar for, let's say, other parties to come in and sell those solutions. And in which case, the only way is to solve the unsolvable, right? Like you really got to come in there and show them that you are experts, as you called out earlier, that the ROI is clearly there, and also that you have history of some performance in solving the use case. And so what I mean by the politics of it is that the barrier to entry is just significantly higher than it was back in the day. And also you have companies that are reducing their spend for SaaS solutions, classic software. So you put all those things together, people would rather make a bet that, hey, if I buy from one of the large hyperscalers or I buy from one of the frontier models and it doesn't work, it's not my fault. I bought the best, right? And that's always been the, hey, if you buy IBM, you're not going to get fired, right?
Right. Yeah.
Scenario that's just creeping up again, as you called out. It's what's old is new.
Yeah. What's interesting, I think what you're distilling there too, is there's also this motion. I've been talking to a lot of CS leaders who are at the front line of this, where enterprises kind of gotten tired of buying software, just even pre LLM. So ignore that for a second, right?
Yeah.
There's a 7-year venture capital spurned disruptor SaaS economy where everyone was finding solutions to solve problems that they were expecting they'd overcommit and underdelivered, but it underdelivered too much. And then price increases are starting to come into play at the same time, right? Like now things are getting more costly and you see the results of it and it's not what you expected. It's almost like the investment in early AI that was driven really at the board level out of fear was like the final straw, right? Where it's like, all right, you know what? Like, pull it back. Like, this is official. Like, you don't have to solve every problem with a piece of software. I think this is what you're describing here, right? Like, now it's like everyone's kind of pulling back and reassessing. I mean, how do you deploy software? And I think the result is entrenched, bigger players that have less risk associated with the logo will actually end up with a moat that we didn't think they'd have compared to incumbents, or not incumbents, the opposite of incumbents, disruptors, right? Great, there's this piece of software. It's cheaper, it's better, but you know what? Like, I'm going to go to the board. I said we did this, and then when my people are mad, I'll just say everyone uses it. Figure it out, right? So, like, that's kind of what you're describing here, right?
Yeah, and there's another interesting little nugget underneath it. What you're noticing is that if you take the frontier models right now, they're giving away the software for free, right? Now, they charge for tokens.
Right.
And so what they're doing is they're allowing you to build software that consumes tokens. They're giving away software that consumes tokens. It's almost like the electricity company selling you your air conditioning for free, right? And as a buyer, you're like, hey, do I want to pay whatever value for that software? Or do I get it for free, build it myself, essentially try to deploy it? And at the end of the day, what we're seeing is a lot of failure on the maintenance side. So, and what's not thought of is like, hey, if you build it, you got to maintain it, you got to update it. Technology changes over the course of a year and a half. And I think what you're going to see, and at least what I'm seeing from some of our customers and what I'm hearing out in the market, is that, like, yeah, they're starting to discover that it isn't necessarily financially better to do that. But I totally agree with you that there has been this software fatigue thing that kicked in, I think 22, 23. And also, look, when you buy from a startup, it's about growth. You're going to get price increases along the way. And oftentimes the entry price may not even be profitable for some companies. I mean, not to call out Anthropic or OpenAI, them either, right? Like the cost of tokens is less than that a company pays for is less than it is to produce it. And so
Mhm.
it's a market that's moving all over the place. And if you're a CIO or a CEO, your job is to last longer than 3 years. So you're going to make the short-term decision, right, to potentially make a larger investment in a safer name that if it goes wrong, that you're less likely to be fired if we're just going to be straight up.
So how are you talking to your team? How's your team talking internally about how to steer into this shift with your economic buyers, your champions on big deals? Uh, are you changing tactics at all? What are you focused on when you're doing deal inspection? What are you focused on to try to solve for this problem?
I think one of the biggest practical things to do is making sure that the AI committee at the organization is engaged extremely early in the cycle. It's a new step in the process, and it's a new mandatory step in the process.
Gotcha.
So back in the day, you had a champion, you had IT, some mid-level IT person inspecting it to make sure that you weren't going to introduce risk into the system. What they were doing were security evaluations and a little bit of making sure that it wasn't duplicitous, right?
Right.
That's how it was functioning. Now it's flipped. So IT's taking a much larger role, and by IT I mean the AI teams and the AI focus component, and also the budgets have gone in that direction. So I think one of the biggest conversations we have is to have that conversation early in assuring that what we're trying to sell within the organization isn't in conflict with what the AI strategy of that organization is. Some companies have a strategy which is like, hey, we buy from a frontier model, we try to build everything ourselves, we let it ride. If it fails, we get another third party solution. We're perfectly fine with that. We've seen companies bounce back 6 months later. Usually, what it causes is delays, not purchasing. And
Yeah.
so they'll try for 6 months and then land at the conclusion that, okay, this isn't worth doing. But I think the difference is now that if you don't have that early engagement with the folks that run the AI strategy, you're going to end up getting shot at the end of the sales cycle. So I think it's changed the way that you do MedPick. It's changed the way that you run a cycle. That's now way ahead. It's not the last step. It's almost the second step once you've found the exact issue in those cases.
Yeah.
That's the biggest change, I would say.
Interesting. That's a really interesting perspective, and you guys are at the forefront of knowing this. It's almost like the shift. What happened? It's easy to forget these things are relatively recent, but it was like the operator who had the problem drove the decision, and procurement was the gate that said this doesn't fit for various different reasons, right? It doesn't fit our contractual ethos, our long-term strategy, whatever that will be, right? And they were the gate. It actually sounds like now because almost every process is a data play at its core, right? Like we have this data that we're generating. How do you turn it into a workflow that like is optimal? That's almost like an IT first discussion in a lot of cases, right? Like how you manage documents at a large organization is an IT strategy piece, and then the operators follow suit, right? It's an interesting shift that you're describing there in the buying cycle.
It's it's basically an area where can you solve the problem with the frontier model and essentially using Claude Code or using Cursor or using Codex? And can you build something? That is now, there isn't even a pause to ask that question. And it gets even more complicated because what you have is various pockets within the organization are trying to randomly build things. Like it is the amount of the number of agents
Yeah.
that are being built within an organization is wild sometimes, and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so as you're going through the organization, I think one
Mm-hmm.
of the
Yeah.
keys is to find the centers of power and be like, look, like here's a use case, here's why it's valuable, here's mathematically why it's important, these 15 customers have also done it. And so the amount of evidence that you need to present very early on is just simply higher now because there's probably some human, like we solve a major problem. I think like 43% of work within a large like knowledge based organization, talking about corporates, right? So if you take a Walmart, yeah, they have 2 million employees, but there's maybe like
Yep.
40,000 folks like doing true corporate work. That is document work, right? And we're talking about even drafting emails, we're talking about proposals, we're talking about contracts, and those are the things that we automate, right? And so I think my observation has been that it's such a huge problem that we're solving that invariably every organization that we run into, someone's trying to do something. And so I think at least for
Yeah.
us and pretty much every company like ours with some specialized expertise, it's coming in and being like, look, we're gonna do it better. We do it better than the frontier models. We do it better than you. And on top
Yeah.
of that, we're almost gonna guarantee that you're gonna get an ROI for it. And so the quality
Yeah.
of your product just needs to be so high right now in order to overcome, I think, the politics of it all, and also the fact that like anybody
Yeah.
who has some skills can build something that works 60%.
Yeah. Right. 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 That's interesting too. And the document piece, it's helpful to be that core process, right? Like, why you don't have expertise, don't touch a core process, right? Like, you could probably vibe code Zoom, right? And then not pay for Zoom
Yeah,
anymore, right? But the
absolutely.
moment Zoom goes down, nobody can get on a meeting. That's an organizational problem. Just pay for Zoom, man. And so I can be mad at Zoom when Zoom goes down, right? So these core
Yeah.
processes, there's a build. Let me ask during the sales process this. I always get a little bit out myself. So how I've steered into
Yeah.
this when I've gotten this, great, we're going to build it scenario. And most people are actually pretty self-aware that building it, there's a chance it doesn't work, right? Like no one's coming to like, we'll build it, it'll be done in a month and it'll implement, right? But like they might as well. I've taken a consultative approach during that. I'm like, cool, let me help you build it, right? So like I've already built it. Let me show you some problems you're going to come across the way and try to be a consultant along the way. And there's two outcomes. One, they build it well and then they don't need me, but perhaps there's something else along the way. Or two, they don't, and I'm right at the doorstep. And I've actually laid the groundwork to like, great, you have all this data where I need it now. Like onboarding is going to be a cinch, right? On this here. Have you found like how are your reps in this like I'm going to build it scenario nurturing those? Are they nurturing them any different? Do you find them like staying on top of it in a way that they didn't before in this buy versus build cycle?
I will say that it is time dependent. I'm going to give you a real honest answer here. It just depends on whether or not there's adequate time to be doing that. Like we run a relatively slim team here, so we're pretty high ARR per person as an organization, and that's been one of the shifts with AI. Right? There's an expectation that you have few employees and lots of revenue. And
Yeah.
so, in light of that, it's almost a new expectation. Remember, even 5 years ago, the size of your organization was almost like a badge of honor. It's like, hey, we're really big. Look at us.
Yeah.
We have so many employees. Today, it's look how few we are and look how much revenue we generate, is the new, I think, the bragging rights here. So, I think what we try to do is make sure we stay engaged with the customer, right? And that requires maybe quarterly or monthly communication with the core team. But remember, there's two players here. Usually, when we discover this, it's because the business wanted it and IT stopped it. If I'm giving you the full the full
Right.
background here, and IT's the one saying like,
Yeah.
"Hey,
Right.
pause," because we wouldn't have gotten there if there wasn't a need. Usually, and I've even been on conversations. If you want to hear some interesting bits, where literally the business is telling the IT folks and the AI folks that, "Hey, I know you're not gonna build this, are you?" But they
Yeah.
have to go through the process. Like they know what's gonna happen. We know what's gonna happen. So we tend to, become close allies to the business unit, and we sit there and wait, right, for them to do what they need to do. If the business need is important enough, eventually that overcomes the delay. But I can't tell you how many times in the past year and a half we've run into a build versus buy. We send over the document. We've actually built out documentation saying this is why this is hard to build. Literally, like
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
right,
Right.
and we hand it to them. We're like, here's the feature sets, here's all the things it does. This is what you're trying to build. And the reason we send that over is because oftentimes IT, they see a 2 minute demo of Templafy and they're like, oh, we could do this. We're like, all right, good luck. I don't even try to challenge it anymore. I tell them that it'll be complicated to build. They're not going to get to the quality that they need. And then I think the best approach I've seen convert the most is to actually take a step back and say, look, we're the experts here. We get it. You got to try to build your shed. And then one storm comes in and then it falls apart. You're like, okay, great. Let me go buy a shed. It's
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think that's a lot of it for, I'd say, the non-household names. Because like we're not at the scale yet where say yet that everybody knows who we are and they know what we do. And so it's easier to take a flyer on, Copilot or something else and be like, well, let's try it
Yeah.
with this. We already have a big contract. We already have like spend that we need to make with a Microsoft. Let's go ahead and try to do it with
Yeah.
this
Not actually care.
software. Yeah, so I think it's having the swagger in the market to be like, we are the best at this. Check, do what you need to
Yeah.
do. Hey, business, are you still having this problem? And 95% of the time, the answer is
Yep.
yeah, they have not solved it. We're like, great, okay.
Yeah. Right.
Is it time?
Yeah. That's a really good call out. Let's combine these two topics into like something
Yeah,
sales futures focused here. So you have document
yeah,
management. You have a new paradigm in how people are compiling, presenting, managing documentation.
yeah.
How does that change? How's that affecting a sales cycle or your internal account executive work, right? Like what should they be doing now or in the future using something like Templafy to help streamline their day? And then what other areas of like the selling cycle do you think are going to change over the next couple of years?
I think the biggest shift has been on research, right? It's the ability to be well informed is incredible now. And if I have to say anything about from 2022 to 2026 is that you should never be going into a conversation blind about what's happening on an active account. Because at least for us, what we've done is connected. We use a OpenAI ChatGPT instance where the organization's data is connected to it. And so it's the ability to ask questions against the account. It's the ability to get notices about things that are happening. And so I think that one of the big keys today is that you have to be extremely well informed, and the data also helps in the sales cycle because, for example, Templafy, we might do 100 different use cases within an organization, right? We might be automating your proposals. We might then be automating your, let's take a large commercial real estate firm in this case. We might be automating the pamphlets that you show when you're walking to the building. At the same time, we're doing the contracts. And the reason I bring that up is that when you're working with one of our customers, you can actually see the data and ask the questions against essentially the AI output to understand, like, hey, they're building X versus they're not building Y, and therefore you should talk to this part of the organization. So there tends to be really good information in the market, and that's for any org, right? And that's any org. You should be leveraging data and AI in order to make better pursuit decisions in that case, and so you can have individual reps be more powerful in those cases. In addition to that, communications, like, there's no more bad written emails. There's hollow emails. I mean, look, AI written emails, they're hollow, but they're good, right? And so
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
eliminated. You don't need to be a great orator. But I think one of the biggest observations I've had is, and you called it out a little bit earlier, is that your top 1% rep is still your top 1% rep. The
Yeah.
difference is now that your bottom rep could appear to be significantly better, but the same traits that made you good, right? The qualities that AI doesn't necessarily change, which is like how engaged are you with the customer? Do they like meeting with you? When you put the meeting on a calendar, like shit, like is this the conversation I want to be having today? So I
Yeah.
think it's the human element of it is still extremely important, but I would say is just making sure that you're tight on your data, and that from the pursuit perspective, especially with like AI SDRs now, that you're leveraging your technology to do all the low risk activity, I would say.
Yeah. That's a great perspective. All right. Well, I'll say second to last question because I want to make sure we come back to what we talked about earlier. So I love
Yeah,
you email the CEO of Templafy. I got a job as strategic account executive. You never really, let's say, had a pure sales role before. So that's awesome. It's something I never did well. I always give advice to younger folks now that I'm in my 40s
yeah,
that don't just back into your next role. Try to pick where you want to work, right? So I kind of backed in. I backed into some great roles, but sometimes I would have wished I was more strategic about where I was working in particular. it's a little bit tight out there, as you mentioned. Like your
Yeah.
efficiency per FTE should be going up. We'll keep it sales focused. In particular, how do you think sales, like I say, account executives that want that dream job should be approaching it in a similar vein? How should they be taking that extra step to get the role that they want?
I think treat it like a pursuit, right? Treat it like a sales cycle. And your book is the companies that you would love to work at, right? So let's say you're a rep and you had a book of 100, right? Do the same thing for a pursuit of a role that you're going to take, right? So it's listing out the organizations that you want to work at. And what's really cool now with Claude and ChatGPT, it's 10 times easier to do the research, right? You don't have to click on each and every website. You don't have to go to an aggregator. You can literally feed it the list. You can pull in the right names. You can get your own license of Lusha. You could send your own emails. And so it's taking the time to actually treat it like you're chasing a deal. Because oftentimes I think the biggest observation I've had is people will do for others what they won't do for themselves. Like they will, for their job, they will send all those emails. For their job, they will make all these calls. For their job, they will have all these interviews. But when it comes to your own career and your own success, there isn't a willingness to put in that type of energy into it. And so I think that's the biggest thing. For me, I wanted out of consulting. I was like, I don't want to be building decks and giving advice that is followed 50% of the time for the rest of my career. And also, I didn't want to be traveling Monday through Thursday every day. It was a wonderful place to work. But I just made a decision and I saw some really cool software that I connected to. And I said, all right, let me go bother people. It wasn't just the CEO. I emailed the CCO at the time. I even applied. There's a funny side story to this one. I applied for this weird marketing role. It was like a mid-level junior marketing role, and I actually got rejected. I think by the the automated system. Anyway, I kept
Oh,
that email because it was fun. I've been there for so long, and I still have that rejection email because I thought it was hilarious.
yeah.
Now looking back at it, but like, not it wasn't just a CEO email. I messaged everybody. And eventually, I got a response. And so, 7.5 years later, I would say it's been a success, getting to a C-level title relatively with my health intact. And so it's, it's you got to shoot the shots similar to how you would shoot it for someone else who's demanding it.
It's a good call out. And when I talk to people, they're skeptical. They're like, well, everyone's doing it. I'm like, no one does it, right? Like the
No
extra mile
one,
does not
very few.
happen nearly as much as you think. It's easy to stand out in the space. And I think what's illuminating what you talked about that I hadn't thought about before in sales, like just because you're like you should continue this journey all the time. So you have your top 100, you get a new role. You're not actively looking for a new role all the time, but you should be nurturing those companies so that like whenever it's time to maybe get something new, you're not starting on a cold start, right? Like, you would never do that in your pipeline from a sales perspective. You want to work somewhere,
True.
it could be 7 to 10 year journey, right? And you end up building a relationship that works out one way or the other in that space. So shouldn't just stop when you get a new role. Just keep the relationships going. On top of it, in sales, it's easy. You have a top 100. Maybe you're selling to 10 of those anyway. So you built a relationship in a future role that they become a future buyer.
Absolutely. I think you're hitting it on the head there. It's especially at the tier 1A companies, like you're going to network your way in. Like it is incredibly hard to apply for a role and get a shot. It just, especially now in the market, like right now, it's about profitable growth for nearly everyone except for maybe four companies out there, right? I'll leave them a name, but we know who they are,
Right.
right? Like they can burn as much VC, PE money as they humanly can. But outside of a select few companies, it's about growing responsibly right now, right? That wasn't the case back in 2021. And what that means is that before hiring a salesperson, right? So back in the day, with even we were guilty of this, is saying, hey, if we hire these 20 people, here's what the success rate should be. Here's how much revenue they should bring in. Let's assume a ramp period that, may or may not match reality of what has actually happened, and this is what the revenue should be. Everybody was doing that. Today that's not the case. Organizations are hiring differently. And also, if there's some interviews I've heard in the past, I think it was like from Oracle, where they're like, listen, if the product's good enough, it'll sell itself. There's also that deep belief at some of the tier 1As. And so, especially at that top tier, like you better know somebody to get in or have networked your way in before you needed to get over there. And even at Templafy, if I look at our hiring pattern, referrals are incredibly important. Especially if it
Yeah.
comes from a person that is a great performer. Like if you're a great performer and you make a referral, the likelihood that person gets hired is actually pretty darn
Pretty darn
high,
high. Yeah.
unless they screw it up. Yeah.
No. Absolutely agree. It's a good way to look at the process. All right, cool. Well, last question. A little bit of a mini hot take or maxi hot take. Where do you see either like the future of work, because that's the space that you're in Templafy, or sales? What's something drastic that might be different 2 years from now than it is today?
Wow, that's such a fantastic question. I do think that you are going to see a major shift in hiring patterns in 2 years. And here's why. When you try to bolt AI into an existing organization, the biggest challenge tends to be that the organization wasn't designed to be an AI first organization. So, like, the fundamental structures of the company didn't actually make sense, right? To just you're just popping AI on top of it. I do think the models will get significantly better. I do believe they will get cheaper, and I do believe they will perform better in 2 years. Like I believe in a J curve there, and I also think that will be enough time for organizations to start restructuring a bit to make it work. And so there's some organizations that were bloated, especially in tech. I think tech you're going to see a big shift. So, for example, there was a comment out there saying, what has more lines of code, a Ford F-150 or Facebook, right? And it's a Ford F-150. So it has more lines of code. A vehicle's a very complicated object if you start thinking about it, like the
Yeah.
amount of things that need to work. And the reason I bring up this example is that a lot of tech companies aren't very complex to actually run. They're not. The big challenge for the shift into AI first has been like their actual structure. It's a discovery of processes, right? And so I think that tech is going to get significantly more narrow in the number of people within, I'd say, the successful large scale organizations. And you're going to end up with a lot of small companies that are popping up because it's so easy to enter. So, what you're
Mm.
going to see is a narrowing of the number of people that work at big tech. Like, it's going to get significantly smaller. And
Mm-hmm.
what you're going to get is artisanal software. So you're going to get like the New York app for restaurant discovery. You're going to get
Mm-hmm.
the Austin tennis, club blah application. You're going to see a lot of that and potentially see AI create like a large swath of small businesses where you only need to be at 2 to 3 million ARR, you write it out, no VC funding. So I think that's a shift you're going to see probably in 2 years of small business making a comeback within the software world.
Yeah. No,
A
that's
little
a great.
weird take, but yeah, I
No,
think you're gonna
I'd
see
say
it.
without expounding on the point, I talk about the same shift all the time. Is that like the again cost of inputs have dropped, so tech should get more narrow and fit the needs of the people they're serving perfectly. And I use the number again. If you're with four, five, six people running a $3 million business, that's a wonderful thing, right? So like,
Yeah.
in that scenario, discovery and trust take a different view than it does now, right? So, like, how do you trust someone that you're working with? How do you discover they exist? That's a completely different shift, right? It's almost like the Shopify model for ecom, right? Where now there's tens of thousands of ecom providers, and so how do you find them, and how do you transact with them easily, and how do you trust who you're transacting with? It could be a weird shift, and then that software is built for you, and it works really well.
You just gave me another thought, and I think what you'll start seeing is that companies that buy software, especially in B2B SaaS, that space, people are going to start knowing who builds their software because the scale of the companies, especially for small business buying software, medium-sized organizations, I think the biggest revolution is going to happen not at the enterprise level, but at like mid-market down, where you can have very localized software to the extent that the founder of that particular company actually knows the buyer pretty darn well. Because even for us at Templafy, like our best
Yeah.
customers are the customers we know extremely well, we have deep relationships with. And obviously at the enterprise level, it's really hard to do that because like there might be 25 people that in some way somehow manage or touch your software. But I think in this world where what you called out, where you have these smaller software companies that are running somewhat locally with very tailored software, especially in light of AI, like that might be this weird small business revolution that if you go back again, and I'll leave with this point, if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, before like the big box stores, before like big malls, yeah, America was dominated by a lot of small business. Even today, like, I think like what some super high 90, 80% of businesses are small businesses. I think what you might end up having is we go right back to a scenario where a lot of software is built that way.
Couldn't agree more, and I'll leave it at that. Jean-Marc, last question. Where can people find you? Your conferences, you post on LinkedIn. If you're posting stuff out into the world, where would the people find it?
Absolutely. I think the first place they can go is to our website. I'm constantly putting out blog posts on Templafy.com, also always posting on LinkedIn, whether it's Forbes Business Development Council articles or different media. And so I would say LinkedIn and Templafy.com would be the best places to hear from me.
Great. Well, you're the first person who plugged their company, so good work on that. So templafy.com is the right one. So I appreciate it. Jean-Marc, take care. I appreciate you being on the show.
All right. Thank you very much. You have a great one.
You're listening to Selling AI, the show where technology meets the bottom line. We explore how to turn artificial intelligence into real business growth. Here's your host.